Good morning. It is Friday, November the 2nd, and this is The Drill. Thank you very much. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States of America, because I'm the only one that makes the presumption for the status quo. So the elections are on Tuesday, and there's a lot of talk about, we got to go out and vote, and because the votes are going to count in terms of shaping this country. No, wrong. The country has basically already shaped itself, and the shape of this country is going to be expressed on Tuesday. We will find out what the shape of this country is, at least for the time being, on Tuesday. And I'm saying that because, again, it isn't politics that shapes our culture. It is the other way around. And shaping the culture requires years, sometimes decades of effort. So that's why conservatives that are hoping to change the direction that they see the country going in have got a lot of work ahead of them. Because they're going to have to work on shaping our culture, and that can only be done individually. Each individual conservative has to do his or her part to help shape the culture. They have to be able to deal with the socialists in their life. They have to be, whether that's their parents, their children, their brothers and sisters, co-workers, other soccer moms, just somebody you happen to meet in line at Vons. Okay. And also part of it is and I'm thinking primarily there are people that are lefties in your life, but also dealing with the rhinos, the people that want to pretend that they're Republicans, but really they're more Democrats or lefties, and again, Republicans in name only. So that's why it's so important that conservatives listen to what's going on. The first thing that I always say is, if you want to make a difference, you want to be effective as a conservative, don't spread the disease. Okay? If you can do nothing else, don't spread the disease, right? One day you wake up and you got a cold. You got the sniffles and stuff like that. You don't go to work and start sneezing on your coworkers, right? Or sneeze into your hand and then wipe it on their sleeve or something. You don't spread the disease. You do what you can to contain it. You either stay home, or if you can't stay home, then you put a sign on your cubicle that says, "I've got a cold, stay away." You try to keep it contained. You got to do the same thing as a conservative. Okay? So many conservatives ape the left. They hear the left say something and they think, wow, that really sounds cool. That really sounds cool. I'm going to say the same thing from now on. Not realizing that they're undermining their own culture. They're cutting the legs out from underneath their political platform. And the classic case of that is stakeholders. Simple word, stakeholders. And I'd hear Sean Hannity use it. I'd hear Rush Limbaugh use it. And other ersatz conservative pundits use it, not realizing what they were doing. They were using an anti-concept. They were undermining a valid concept called conflict of interest. See, the way conflict of interest works is those people that have a conflict of interest are expected to recuse themselves from any debate in which they have that conflict of interest, right? So if we're going to go out and talk about, have a discussion about policy, and the policy directly affects you, then you have a potential conflict of interest there, or a real conflict of interest, and you need to bow out of the conversation. You're still allowed to vote if it comes up for a vote, because everybody votes their interest. But as far as a debate is concerned, where we're supposed to have some objectivity, you're expected to bow out. Now, where this is important is in public employee unions. Public employee unions were a bad idea, according to every single politician in this country, right, left, and center. Nobody wanted it. Everybody agreed it was a bad idea. And it is a bad idea, not because everybody agreed it was, but because public employee unions are an inherent conflict of interest. Okay? So they knew it was a bad idea, so the unions that want to organize public employees, what do? What are we going to do? How do we deal with this? Let me see, we could run around and tell people not to think about conflict of interest, or we could run around and say, hey, unionizing public employees really isn't a conflict of interest. We could try it that way, but that's almost impossible. We're trying to prove a negative, and it is impossible, as a matter of fact. So they know they've got to find a way to undercut the concept of conflict of interest. And they think, and they think, and they think, and they come up with a brilliant scheme. And that is stakeholders. Instead of referring to conflict of interest, we will simply refer to people as stakeholders. Makes it sound positive. Makes it sound like, as a matter of fact, the fact that, because again, you're going to have public employees that are going to be lobbying to become public employee union members. And part of that is, and trying to get into the debate, which they shouldn't get into. And if they have a conflict of interest, they won't get into the debate. But if they can say, wait a minute, I'm a stakeholder. That's different. Stakeholder, that means I have to be part of the argument. I have to be part of the debate. Okay, so our culture changed as a result of this change in one word by people forgetting about and not using and just leaving aside the term conflict of interest, which you still to this day rarely hear mentioned. By simply doing that, they changed our culture. And when our culture had sufficient change to it, and people were talking stakeholders instead of conflict of interest, the attitude towards public employee unions changed with it. They said, oh, public employee unions? Oh, no, they're stakeholders. Sure, why not? And right after that followed whatever votes or legislation was necessary, local levels, etc., in order to get these people unionized. Okay, so the point is, it happened from the culture up, not politics down. It wasn't a bunch of politicians that got together and said, you know what, public employees really need to be unionized, and damn it, we're not going to rest until that happens. No. It was a change in the culture that forced whatever politicians were in office at the time to change the law. And that's the way it works. So the point is, whatever's going to happen Tuesday is going to happen Tuesday. And don't expect that whatever happens Tuesday is going to radically change the country. It isn't. If the country is going to be radically changed, then it already has been, by whatever cultural forces have been operating on it over the past years and decades. And remember that if you want to change the country, the best way to do it is start with yourself. Don't spread the disease. Confront socialists whenever and wherever you can in your life. When I come back, a little bit of Ayn Rand's Lexicon. Okay, thank you very much, and welcome back. And the concept of the day for today is conservatives. Objectivists are not conservatives. We are radicals for capitalism. We are fighting for that philosophical base which capitalism did not have and without it which it was doomed to perish. Politics is based on three other philosophical disciplines: metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, on a theory of man's nature and of man's relationship to existence. It is only on such a base that one can formulate a consistent political theory and achieve it in practice. When, however, men attempt to rush into politics without such a base, the result is that embarrassing conglomeration of impotence, futility, inconsistency, and superficiality, which is loosely designated today as conservatism. Today's culture is dominated by the philosophy of mysticism, irrationalism, altruism, collectivism. The base from which only statism can be derived. The statists of any brand, communist, fascist, or welfare, are merely cashing in on it, while the, quote, conservatives, unquote, are scurrying to ride on the enemy's premises and somehow to achieve political freedom by stealth. It can't be done. What are the conservatives? What is it that they're seeking to conserve? It is generally understood that those who support the conservatives expect them to uphold the system which has been camouflaged by the loose term of the American way of life. The moral treason of the conservative leader lies in the fact that they are hiding behind that camouflage. They do not have the courage to admit that the American way of life was capitalism, that was the politico-economic system born and established in the United States, the system which, in one brief century, achieved a level of freedom, of progress, of prosperity, of human happiness unmatched in all other systems and centuries combined, and that is the system which they are now allowing to perish by silent default. If the conservatives do not stand for capitalism, they stand for and are nothing. They have no goal, no direction, no political principles, no social ideals, no intellectual values, no leadership to offer anyone. Yet capitalism is what the conservatives dare not advocate or defend. They are paralyzed by the profound conflict between capitalism and the moral code which dominates our culture, the morality of altruism. Capitalism and altruism are incompatible. They are philosophical opposites. They cannot coexist in the same man or in the same society. What is the moral stature of those who are afraid to proclaim that they are the champions of freedom? What is the integrity of those who outdo their enemies in smearing, misrepresenting, spitting at, and apologizing for their own ideal? What is the rationality of those who expect to trick people into freedom, cheat them into justice, fool them into progress, con them into preserving their rights, and while indoctrinating them with statism, put one over on them and let them wake up in a perfectly capitalist society some morning? These are the conservatives, or most of their intellectual spokesmen. There are three interrelated arguments used by today's conservatives to justify capitalism, which can best be designated as the argument from faith, the argument from tradition, the argument from depravity. Sensing their need of a moral base, many conservatives decided to choose religion as their moral justification. They claim that America and capitalism are based on faith in God. Politically, such a claim contradicts the fundamental principles of the United States. In United States. In America, religion is a private matter which cannot and must not be brought into political issues. Intellectually, to rest one's case on faith means to concede that reason is on the side of one's enemies, that one has no rational arguments to offer. The conservatives claim that their case rests on faith, means that there are no rational arguments to support the American system, no rational justification for freedom, justice, property, individual rights. That these rest on a mystic revelation and can be accepted only on faith. That in reason and logic the enemy is right, but men must hold faith as superior to reason. Consider the implications of that theory. While the communists claim that they are representatives of reason and science, the conservatives concede it and retreat into the realm of mysticism, of faith, of the supernatural, into another world, surrendering the world to communism. It is the kind of victory that the communists' irrational ideology could never have won on its own merits. Now consider the second argument, the attempt to justify capitalism on the ground of tradition. Certain groups are trying to switch the word conservative into the exact opposite of its modern American usage, to switch it back to its 19th century meaning and put this over on the public. These groups declare that to be a conservative means to uphold the status quo, the given, the established, regardless of what it might be, regardless of whether it is good or bad, right or wrong, defensible or indefensible. They declare that we must defend the American political system not because it is right, but because our ancestors choose it, not because it is good, but because it is old. So, really quick here, I want to interject here. This is exactly what I'm advocating and suggesting and saying, not suggesting, saying outright that being a conservative means to make the presumption for the status quo, or conserve the status quo, which is she's absolutely right. But she's wrong in saying that the basis for this is tradition, that we're going to support the status quo, and we're supporting the status quo because whatever it happens to be the status quo is traditional. We support the status quo because it is a benevolent universe, and we know that by the evidence of our senses. And because it's a benevolent universe, we know that success is to be expected. And because success is to be expected, then we can go ahead and make the presumption for the status quo. Now, and part of this also is what she misses here is that making the presumptions for the status quo is where you begin any debate. Any debate starts by making the presumption for the status quo, and anyone who wants change has the burden of proof. Why? Because it is impossible to prove a negative. You can't switch it around. You can't say, well, we're going to make the presumption for change. I dare anybody to tell me why we shouldn't change. That's a trap, an intellectual trap, and it's the trap that the left perpetrates on the right every day, over and over again, and successfully. Because idiot conservatives will bother to try to do exactly what the left is baiting them into doing, proving a negative. Okay, so we make the presumption for the status quo, again, not because of tradition or because it's traditional. We make the presumption for the status quo because it is logical, reasonable. Now, does that mean, because what she's suggesting in that paragraph was that conservatives are people that are deathly afraid of change and are going to cling to the present? Because she says in this, let me see, uphold the status quo, the given, the established, regardless of what it might be, regardless of whether it's good, bad, right, wrong, defensible, or indefensible. Wrong, 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 wrong. As I've always said, I'm not afraid of change. I'm a conservative. I make the presumption for the status quo. And I'm willing to change, but only when there's an obvious case for change. And it is the left's responsibility. Anybody that's advocating change has the burden of proof. But looking at it from a left-right perspective, the left always has the burden of proof, not the right, not the conservatives. So I'm willing to change when I see an obvious case for change. I've named two that are my favorites, slavery and Jim Crow, obvious cases for change. I've also named current ones. One of them is public employee unions. Public employee unions are an obvious case for change. Why? Because they are an inherent conflict of interest. So what, you say? A conflict of interest is the essence of corruption. We very often in the United States sneer at other countries, the Philippines, Mexico, and say they're corrupt. Actually, we are corrupt as well. The difference between the United States and Mexico or the Philippines is not corruption, it is the tolerance of corruption. Our culture does not tolerate corruption. We frown on it and we try to get rid of it. But in any case, the point is corruption, the essence of corruption is conflict of interest. And the greater degree to which we have conflict of interest in our civilization, the greater degree to which we are corrupt. So, public employee unions are an inherent conflict of interest. They're therefore corrupt. They therefore have to go. Period. Okay. What we change it into, we can have a debate about. I say we go back to civil, what were they called? Civil servants. Okay, there used to be they had a grade scale and whatnot. You're paid based on a civil servant scale. The military has that, where you have civilians that work in the military, and they're called GS. GS 9, GS 12, and GS means grade scale. And then you have ES, I believe it is, which is up the top, which is executive service, when you're getting up close to the president. And I think the president even has an ES rating. He's an ES 5, 6, whatever it is. So it's like in the military, you have a rank and you have a pay grade. In the Air Force, a staff sergeant is the rank. The pay grade is E5. Anyhow, so where was I going with this? We have the pay grade. It goes to E5. Oh, that's what I'm suggesting we change this into. Okay, but we can have a debate about that. Where should we take? And we can't have public employee unions because they are obviously corrupt, and that is an obvious case for change. So I'm willing to change, but I am not going to make the presumption for change. That is what differentiates true conservatives from socialists, and from faux conservatives, and from phony conservatives. Okay, the phony conservatives are the racist groups, the ones that the left loves to lump in with the right and refer to them as the far right, but they're not, they're left. The KKK does not make the presumption for the status quo. They make the presumption for change. They're idealistic. That's another way you can tell whether conservatism is realistic. Inherently and essentially realistic, whereas the left is inherently idealistic. So, anyways, I've taken that up. So we'll go on to the next paragraph. The argument that we must respect tradition as such, respect it merely because it is a tradition, means that we must accept the values other men have chosen, merely because other men have chosen them, with the necessary implication of who are we to change them? The affront to man's self-esteem in such an argument and the profound contempt for man's nature are obvious. This leads us to the third and the worst argument used by some conservatives, the attempt to defend capitalism on the ground of man's depravity. The argument runs as follows. Since men are weak, fallible, non-omniscient, and innately depraved, no man may be entrusted with the responsibility of being a dictator and of ruling everybody else. Therefore, a free society is a proper way of life for imperfect creatures. Please grasp fully the implications of this argument. Since men are depraved, they are not good enough for a dictatorship. Freedom is all they deserve. If they were perfect, they would be worthy of a totalitarian state. Dictatorship. This theory asserts, believe it or not, that the result of faith in man and in man's goodness. If people believe that man is depraved by nature, they would not entrust a dictator with power. This means that a belief in human depravity protects human freedom, that it is wrong to enslave the depraved, but be right to enslave the virtuous. And more, dictatorships, this theory declares, and all other disasters of the modern world are man's punishment for the sin of relying on his intellect and of attempting to improve his life on earth by seeking to devise a perfect political system and to establish a rational society. This means that humility, passivity, lethargic resignation, and a belief in original sin are the bulwarks of capitalism. One could not go farther than this in historical, political, and psychological ignorance or subversion. This is truly the voice of the Dark Ages rising again in the midst of our industrial revolution. The cynical, man-hating advocates of this theory sneer at all ideals, scoff at all human aspirations, and deride all attempts to improve men's existence. You can't change human nature is their stock answer to the socialists. Thus, they concede that socialism is the ideal, but human nature is unworthy of it. After which they invite men to crusade for capitalism. A crusade one would have to start by spitting in one's own face. Who will fight and die to defend his status as a miserable sinner? If, as a result of such theories, people become contemptuous of conservatism, do not wonder and do not ascribe it to the cleverness of socialists. So it goes, there's several other paragraphs, but I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. The only thing I want to say on this particular paragraph is that I've never heard of that particular theory, the advocating capitalism via depravity. And by and large, again, conservatism isn't about being pro-capitalism or being anti-capitalism. Right now, the economic system we have is not capitalist and it's not socialist. It's a third one. It's called Keynesian. It's a Keynesian economy. And we make the presumption for that unless there's an obvious case for change, and there is. Okay, but that's a subject for another time. So, anyways, we'll finish that up next time because she's got much more to say about conservatives and conservatism. So, when I come back, I found another book by Benjamin Weicker. I've been reading the 10 books that screwed up the world and 5 that didn't help. And he has now a book out called The 10 Books Every Conservative Must Read. When I come back. Okay, thank you. I'm back, and so let's see here. I got this and this, and there we go. So I'm going to go ahead and read to give you an idea of this. Benjamin Weicker, again, wrote the book, 10 Books That Screwed Up the World and 5 That Didn't Help. And he has also a book now, because he said that a lot of people wrote to him and asked him, why don't you do something that's positive? You know, it's great that you did the negative ones, what we shouldn't read or what we should dismiss or not take too seriously. But what about books that we should be reading? And so he came up with the 10 books every conservative must read. So from the table of contents, part 1, just what exactly is conservatism? Chapter 1, The Politics by Aristotle. And then chapter 2, Gilbert Keith Chesterton, Orthodoxy. It's got a book called Orthodoxy. And chapter 3, The New Science of Politics by Eric Voegelin. Chapter 4, The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis. And then part 2 is Democracy and the Founding of the American Regime. Chapter 5, Reflections on the Revolution in France by Edmund Burke. Chapter 6, Democracy in America by Alexis de Tocqueville. Chapter 7, The Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison et al. Chapter 8, The Anti-Federalists, and the Fear of Federal Despotism. That doesn't appear to be the name of a book. Part 3, The Place of Economics for Conservatives. Chapter 9, The Servile State by Hilaire Belloc. Chapter 10, The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich August von Hayek. Part 4, The Conservative Story and Conservative Stories. Chapter 11, The Tempest by William Shakespeare. Chapter 12, Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. Chapter 13, The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. That's a surprise to me. So was Jane Austen. Chapter 14, The Jerusalem Bible. That's interesting too. And there's the first part of that chapter reads, why this translation? Because that's the first thing I'm thinking. Why the Jerusalem Bible? I'm used to the King James Version. Chapter 15, Atlas Shrugged. And that's the one, because he says 10 books that every American or every conservative should read, and one imposter. and Atlas Shrugged is the one he considers the imposter. So, good stuff, and so I'm going to be reading from that from time to time. Let's see, we're going to do this, come back to here, there we go. So, and we'll, I got a sample of it, so I just want to read the table of contents and give you an idea of what the author thinks are the books every conservative must read. So when I come back, I'm going to be reading from the New York City Cab Driver's Joke Book. All right, thank you very much. Heard any good ones lately? Jim Peach, a real New York City cabbie, has heard them all. From business people, unemployed laborers, Wall Street lawyers, prostitutes, writers, tourists, drug dealers, and lovers. All from the back seat of his cab as he makes his way around New York City. Jim always asks his customers for their best jokes, and here are his favorites. More than 400 clean jokes, dirty jokes, ethnic jokes, religious jokes, Dirty Ernie jokes, jokes about musicians, bartenders, hookers, everyone. The New York City Cab Driver's Joke Book also includes true stories about Jim's writers and original illustrations by Jim himself. The cabbie with the best collection of jokes in New York City. A man with a poodle goes into a bar. After ordering a drink, he tells the bartender that he would like to buy some cigarettes. But the bartender replies that, unfortunately, they have run out. So the man says, "That's all right, I'll just send my dog across the street to get some." He searches through his pockets for money and discovers that the smallest bill he has is a 20. He puts it in the dog's mouth and tells the dog, "Boy, run across the street and get me some cigarettes. And don't forget to bring back the change." Immediately, the poodle runs out of the front door. A man sitting at the bar says to the dog's owner, "Say, that dog is really something. Is he really going to bring cigarettes back to you?" "Sure," says the man. "He can do all sorts of stuff. He's an amazing dog." Just then, they hear the loud sound of tires screeching. The man looks up with fear in his eyes and says, "Oh, no!" He runs out to the street and sees a car stopped in front of the bar. When he runs around to the front of the car, he sees that it did not hit his dog after all, but managed to stop just in time. The reason, however, for the sudden stop was to avoid hitting the dog, who was humping another poodle right in the middle of the road. "Hey," says the man to his dog, "what's going on? You never did anything like this before." The dog looks up and says, "Hey, I never had $20 before." And on that note, we conclude another episode of The Drill. And until next time, thank you very much for listening, and have a great day.